This is the Doorstep. Sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. Featuring Nikolas, Gvosdev, Tatiana, Serafin, and Nahal Toosi. This episode was recorded on October 8th, 2020.
Good morning and welcome to the Doorstep. I'm your co-host, Nikolas Gvosdev, one of the senior fellows here at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs.
Thank you, Nick. And I'm Tatiana Serafin, co-host of the Doorstep and professor of journalism at Marymount Manhattan College. We are so excited to welcome today on our podcast where we talk about international news that you may have missed and how it affects your day-to-day life. Nahal Toosi from Politico to help us cover this couple of weeks events that we haven't been with you. We are so excited to have Nahal, who covers foreign policy and national security for Politico. Her work has taken her from the halls of the U.S. State Department to refugee camps in Asia. And in 2019, she was a finalist for the National Magazine Award in reporting for her story on the plight of Rohingya Muslims in Bangladesh and Myanmar. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nahal. We really appreciate it. We're going to get right to it because, wow, what a couple of weeks it's been. Nick and Nahal, what we have gone through so much, maybe a year's worth of news in the last 2 weeks. So let's catch up today on things that we may have missed or angles of stories that we may not be talking about that we should be. The first one is our president's health crisis. As we all know, early Friday morning, the president announced he had tested positive for COVID. He went into Walter Reed over the weekend for treatment and came out saying he was healthier and stronger than ever. In the meantime, the world was watching and talking about us. And what were they saying? I was particularly really interested in reading the Political article with the title that I thought was brilliant, "The World's Hottest Spy Target, Trump's Health." And let me just read a paragraph and then toss it to you, Nahal and Nick, and see what you think about this. So the article reads, "Foreign adversaries are working overtime to glean insight into the true state of Trump's health and potentially use it as leverage to make mischief and sow doubt about the stability of the U.S. government." Do you think that this has been a concern for the administration in showing the president taking off his mask and standing there like a hero? Has this been their primary concern in projecting strength to circumvent any kind of misinformation about health?
So my take on this is that, sure, there are definitely people in the administration itself, from career staffers at the CIA to the State Department and beyond, who are keeping track of this and trying to make sure that, that we make it clear to other countries that we are on solid footing regardless of the state of the health of President Trump. Now, for President Trump, yeah, him taking off his mask, having his balcony moment, that sort of thing, it was about projecting strength, but I don't think he was thinking, oh, this is about projecting strength to other countries. It's more about the election for him. It's more about the voters and trying to rally his base. So when you think about those two things together, of course, if I was a foreign intelligence official, absolutely, I would nonetheless see this as a potentially vulnerable time where people might be distracted. And therefore, maybe I could, peek in and get some information that I otherwise couldn't. Also, this stuff like this, where it looks like our system is like, not as strong as it could be. It's a good time to recruit people, to work for you. And so because you might find that person who's in the government or whatever, and who's disgruntled and who's just disgusted with the way that the US government has handled the situation, and they're willing suddenly to work for a foreign spy agency. So these are some of the factors that I'm sure the foreign intelligence agencies are considering.
And Nick, when we talk about foreign spies, what countries are we looking at specifically to undermine some of the messaging that's coming out?
Well, I think you're looking obviously at the main great power competitor targets, so Russia and China in particular, but this is something of concern to friends and partners as well as competitors alike. Everyone is going to want to be getting a sense of information, what's going on, who's in charge, is the U.S. government distracted? Is this the time to do something to take advantage of what might appear to be certainly with the election already, but then if the health of the chief executive is up in the air, and as we know, he made no provision when he went to Walter Reed to transfer power to the vice president. And so and as we know, this is a very personalized White House. A lot of the key political appointee positions are either held by acting appointees or are left unfilled. So a lot of things flow up into the White House. And not just the president, but keep in mind, the entire West Wing is essentially a hot spot with people who are out for the count, either quarantining or who are sick. And this represents a moment of instability. It is perhaps then not accidental that we see other countries taking advantage of this to do things, whether it's the war that's now breaking out in the Caucasus, or some of the moves Turkey has been taking, some of the moves that China and Russia have been taking. If you think that the U.S. is distracted and isn't likely to formulate a coherent response until January of next year, this is, as you said, it's a perfect time to make some mischief. But even for our allies, this is of concern, because you want to know what's going on and how this relates to commitments that you might have from the United States. Is the United States going to see them through, or is the United States government so focused on what's happening? And again, this crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean, I think, highlights that question of what happens if the U.S. is absent.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, Nick. This is exactly the story of the week that I hope we can focus on. The fighting that has resumed in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan is the conflict that you're mentioning. And I think it's important to note where the U.S. stands here. In previous years, the U.S. was one of the lead negotiators to try to find some sort of a deal. There are some indications that France, Russia, and the U.S. are going to lead talks in upcoming days to try to find a ceasefire. That's been going on for the last couple of weeks, hasn't been getting a lot of attention in the news. The area that they're fighting over is about the size of Delaware. So it's not a big area geographically, but it is a big problem politically and geopolitically, because we have, of course, the involvement of Iran and Turkey. Iran saying that this could lead to a regional all-out war. And we, of course, not part of the Iran nuclear deal anymore. So where does that lead us with Iran? So there's all this domino effect of issues that all start with this tiny piece of land. What have you heard about what America may or may not be doing in the coming weeks?
I'm going to plead some ignorance on this. I mean, I have heard virtually nothing from the U.S. government on this. I mean, I'm certain there are people who focus on this and who are trying to, nail down like exactly what they can do. I believe there's been calls for a ceasefire, discussions, that sort of thing. But I haven't, and Nick, please correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I've been dealing with a lot of stuff, but I haven't really seen like a formal move by the United States to get involved. And I'm not sure. I mean, look, this is something that not only involves Turkey and Iran, but also Russia. And so the question is, does the U.S. really want to play that big of a role besides, making statements? Tell me, Nick, if I'm wrong.
Well, that's a great point you've brought up, and it leads, first of all, we would have expected the U.S. to be playing a greater role. And this, by the way, touches back on something that is the reason for this type of podcast, which is, for most Americans, they're not going to know where Nagorno-Karabakh is. It's really an issue of concern primarily to Armenian and Azeri diasporas in the United States. But it is one of these things where most Americans may not know where it is or particularly care about the specifics of the actual conflict, but it's one of those where small problems left untended can become bigger problems down the road. And, it raises two questions. One is, this is the potential, Tatiana, as you said, the domino effect. What happens when you have Turkey, Russia, Iran, that could potentially come into conflict. And once you start talking about Turkey and Russia coming into conflict, then it starts to involve NATO. What about U.S. commitments? Does the U.S. get involved? Does it get dragged in? Does it create a crisis in the alliance? And then suddenly this snowballs down the road. But the interesting thing, to ask then, Nahal, is saying that, and it's true, I mean, my sense is the U.S. has not been doing a lot on this issue. We have been very slow to react. We don't seem to be investing a lot of time. This is certainly not an issue that I think the president himself really has decided to spend any time handling. And then again, in the past administration, this is the type of thing where President Obama would have Vice President Biden be the point person, but it's not clear that Vice President Pence is going to be playing any sort of role in this. And then it raises the question, so what are they focusing on? As you said, you're not hearing that much is going on. So what is then gripping their attention? And is it just the election? Is it getting to November 3rd, and then the rest will pick up things? So
I think,
yeah. So I mean, if I did a bit of research. I mean, today it's been announced that France, the U.S., and Russia are going to hold talks in Geneva about this situation. But the countries that are missing from those talks, Armenia and Azerbaijan, and Turkey. So I mean, look, it looks like there are some things in motion, and this is what happens when you spend 5 minutes not looking at Twitter. You miss things. But look, I mean, what the U.S. right now. Look, what does the U.S. gain from getting involved in this? Okay, now on the one hand, it just could look like another flop if nothing comes together and the U.S. puts its neck out there and then it's not able to succeed in anything. Why should Trump, and the others want to be pointed to for another failure? And why should the U.S. necessarily even have to take responsibility for all of this? Now, that being said, there are energy concerns, right? There are these other economic questions. There's a number of other factors. This idea that this could spiral out of control, and then the U.S. is a bit more concerned because it not only affects us to some extent, though not the way it would have years ago, but also our allies. And so these are some of the issues that come up in that broader region, and so yeah, it's tricky. But I mean, right now they're so focused on the election. It's going to be strange, to be honest, because if they lose the election, how the Trump administration handles the transition is going to be really fascinating, right? Because if they know that they've only got a few months, are they going to go out there and take risks, or are they going to just stop caring completely and let things spiral out of control? What are they going to want to leave a Biden administration with? And that's going to be the subject, I'm sure, of PhD dissertations in the future.
I think that is so important. And both of you kind of lead up to our next section, which is looking at what does a Biden foreign policy look like if they win? What does a term 2 Trump foreign policy look like if they win? And how does that impact us on a day-to-day level, the American people on a day-to-day level? And these are the things that kind of didn't come up last week in the debate. I want to read some comments about the debate from international press. The Times in the UK wrote, "The clearest loser from the first presidential debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden was America. Chaotic, childish, grueling." That's how French newspaper Libération described Tuesday's debate. Der Spiegel analysis of the debate headlined, "A TV duel like a car accident." And then, of course, the Kremlin outlets and state media have used the debate to highlight President Biden's poor health and age and portray Biden as being beholden to sensitive voting blocs. Meanwhile, portraying President Trump as outrageous but forceful. Never mind that Biden then called President Trump Putin's puppy. That was a big headline from that last week. However, that had nothing to do at all with our standing in the world until last night. A glimmer of hope. when there was a question thrown to the candidates about America's standing in the world. And somehow we learned in a millisecond that Biden-Harris want to engage with the world again, want to have friends, right? That was the big feel that I got from Kamala Harris's description versus this, we are strong, said Pence. We are very strong. We were strong against ISIS. We're strong against Iran. We're strong against China. We are strong, strong, strong. But it seemed also very me. And as Harris put it, an isolationist stance. So I loved, Nahal, your piece looking at what will the world do if there's a Biden presidency, and what Trump foreign policies Biden might keep. I love that headline, what Trump foreign policies Biden might keep. So are they more similar than we think? What should the American people think about this millisecond that people spent on foreign policy last night?
Actually, yeah, I think there are more similarities between Biden and Trump than people might think. And I think it's because we're talking about the Biden of 2020, right? Not the Biden of the Obama years. The Biden of 2020 has been affected, from everything from his son's passing, his son who was a veteran of Afghanistan, and who died of cancer, to the progressive movement and the incredible amount of pressure that they're bringing on him to take certain positions that at certain times actually put him in alignment with President Trump. So for instance, trade, right? In the past, Biden would have been a total free trade type of guy, but because of the progressive pressure, he is actually very much likely going to be much more careful about striking trade agreements down the line, because there's so much anxiety in the U.S. Among ordinary workers about how these deals affect them. And so we have, the Biden team is basically has put together a foreign policy that, I'm not kidding, under his foreign policy platform, he includes raising the minimum wage and reforming the criminal justice system. If you look at the platform, it's like this complete mix where all of the silos that used to exist, that separated one type of policy from another, have kind of broken down, and then trying to mix it all up. And they're basically saying, it's all one policy. And I'm writing a little bit about this in our Global Translations newsletter that's going to run tomorrow. So I mean, on trade is an example, and where I think that he's going to align more with Trump than people think. And there's certain things that Trump has done that simply, Biden's just going to keep because it just kind of makes sense. I mean, he's not going to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv from Jerusalem. It's sort of a fait accompli on that. The Taliban peace negotiations, I would think that the Biden team would want to build on those and see them through one way or another, though they might have some tweaks to it. And so there's certain things where they're also not going to want to necessarily swing the pendulum back too far in the other direction, because that sends a really bad message to the rest of the world. The rest of the world is like, oh man, all right, so every time a new party takes power in the White House, we're going to have a 180 each time. How are we going to plan for this? And I think the Biden team is very well aware of that. And while there are certain things that they absolutely are going to reverse, like a lot of the immigration stuff, there's other things they're going to think about very carefully and think, maybe we need to keep some of this stuff now. And I would also say this, I think he's also, one of the lessons that everybody's learned from the Trump years is that that you can do certain things, you can use your leverage in a way that is strong, and the sky won't fall. There were all these there were all these beliefs that if you move the embassy to Jerusalem, the entire Middle East will go up in flames, or if you do this other stuff, that it would all fall apart, and then none of it happened. And so I think the Biden team is going to look at this and be like, maybe we can put tariffs down on this country, or maybe we can use this mechanism, and we won't necessarily have the whole thing blow up in our face.
What do you think, Nick? What about our international relationships? NATO, you mentioned earlier in our conversation. Do you think that a Biden administration or a Trump 2 administration might do more with NATO, reach out more, or not?
I think that no matter who takes office in January, if it's, the Biden-Harris team or, Trump-Pence scrapes through and makes it into a second term, there's just certain things that can no longer be avoided. The Munich Security Conference just released their 2020 report, and they had a wonderful line in it where they said America is that the attitude in America is that America is tired of overpaying for the world, for the protection of allies. And this is a trend, no matter if it's, a Biden administration will have a different tone. They aren't going to be so abrasive. They may not be so brinksmanship-like. They're not going to be so openly transactional, the way that President Trump would bluster in a European summit and say, you have to pay for this. If you don't pay us this or give us these concessions, then we're going to stop protecting you. But the Biden team is still going to be facing with this question of what is it that Europeans, for instance, can do on defense. What can they do on trade to help ensure that there is a more equitable balance of trade between the European Union and the United States? What does this mean for Europe having to do more for its own defense if the U.S. needs to pivot more to the Middle East or Asia Pacific, and that the American cavalry can't come riding over the horizon? The other thing, and I think that Nahal, you raised a very good point. This is not the Biden of 2016. I think initially you had a lot of people assuming that Biden was going to just try to turn the clock back. That if he were to be elected, it would be, I just want to go back to what the Obama administration was doing. But there's too much water under the bridge now that's flowed. Some of that is that partners in other parts of the world are aware that the U.S. is wobblier on commitments than it would have been, and they're taking that into account. But that the American public isn't where it is in 2016. You mentioned the rise of the progressives within the Democratic Party, and most people think of the progressives in terms of their domestic agenda, as you pointed out, criminal justice and income inequality, but they also have a direction in foreign policy. They're not as wedded to the Church of Atlanticism that previous generation of Democrats were. They aren't going to just simply say, more military spending, more deployments. The Pew poll that came out, or sorry, it was either the Pew or the Chicago Council poll among younger people, saying, which they assumed, one of the assumptions going in is that, well, young people will support, younger generations, millennials, Gen Z, will always support military intervention for defending human rights. And what they found was the polling data said we should take a strong stand on human rights, but not necessarily U.S. military interventions. So I think you have within the Democratic caucus moving forward, and to the extent that Biden himself has said that he is a transitional figure of leadership, that he will bridge the generations. It could lead to changes down the road where the U.S. is not as involved or is not the first responder, certainly not the military first responder. And so that will be interesting. And this idea too of, the idea that there are certain, Trump and Biden things that kind of come back around each other and trade being one of the most interesting ones, that, that the Joe Biden is going to be not going to be able to just with the stroke of a pen reinstate the Trans-Pacific Partnership, U.S. participation in Trans-Pacific Partnership and other things of that sort. And again, this comes back to, for Americans, I think that there is a sense that foreign policy, even if they don't know much about it on any specific issue, that there is a growing concern of, well, how do these things impact me in the pocketbook, what I pay for goods and services, and particularly if, and this is where the point about negotiations to ending the Afghan war, I think people are tired of, even if it's with the volunteer military, they're tired of kind of these drip conflicts around the world that seem to never end. And I think you're going to see pressure for that.
And I agree with everything you said, and I actually have a magazine story coming out later this week about Biden and progressives and his foreign policy. So I urge you guys to look at that. And one of the most interesting things I learned as I was reporting this was that progressives, basically for the most part, really did not have much of a presence or an organization or a movement when it came to foreign policy, even at the beginning of the Obama years. But they kind of were hoping Obama would do what they wanted on foreign policy. And then he disappointed them. And so over time, they became more organized to become much of a force than they are today. And one of the things that catalyzed their coalition building and organization among progressives was the Iran nuclear deal. Because, there was a massive fight in Washington over whether to accept this nuclear deal or not, progressives groups got organized, and they have built on that organization in the years since to come up with much more thoughtful, ideas about what progressive foreign policy is. But, there are still plenty of things where they haven't quite figured it out. And Nick, one of the ones you mentioned was this idea of using the military to, stop a human rights crisis, like a genocide or something like that. And there's still things that, they have to work out.
I think when you look at the younger generations, especially Gen Z, they've grown up without this idea of war, without this idea of going into the military. Many families don't even know military members. And so it becomes this, what do you mean? I just want to travel. Open the border, and that becomes more of a focus. But
do you guys get the impression that Gen Z just looks at all of us like we're idiots? That's how I feel. Like every time I see some smart thing by some teenager, I'm like, my God, they must be looking at all of us grown-ups like we are complete morons. And you know what? They might have a point.
I think the question from the 8th grader in last night's debate was very telling. Why do you guys always just argue? Why can't you just get along? And I think that we want to see more of commonality, and I think that's what we've been talking about in looking at the Biden and Trump policies. There's more commonality than we think. But what can we look at, and what examples do we have from Europe? I want to move us to our next section, because Europe, by the way, nobody's talking about it anymore. They're still in the Brexit negotiations. Years and years and years later, it's still happening. Boris Johnson's given October 15th deadline for a deal with the EU. They're hung up over state aid and North Ireland customs. And once again, the UK, Boris Johnson's blustering that they're just going to do whatever they want at the end of the year, when this is all supposed to come into effect. Can we learn anything going forward from what's going on in the UK? You mentioned, Nick, that we don't have as strong Atlanticist tendency, but I do think that we do still have strong ties with the UK, and we should maybe look at what's going on with those negotiations, even though it hasn't been in the news really at all.
Yeah, the one thing though there is that, the bet that a lot of U.S. companies made about locating their, European operations in the UK is, a bet now that has to be revisited as, depending on how these final negotiations go, or if you just have the British leaving and there's no agreement, and what do? Do you move all your operations to Ireland or somewhere else in order to be able to stay within the frame of the common market? But I think that this really speaks to this, both the Brits leaving and then all of these issues, why they can't get an agreement and everything else, I think speaks to a problem which is more than just the specific issues, the technical issues around Brexit, Northern Ireland customs border and state aid and other things. It's that we're running out of steam in many ways. We've been living in this post-Cold War, ever since the Berlin Wall fell, and it'll be, 31 years this November. We've still been living off of the energy of that move in Europe. And that this was going to move Europe closer together. It was going to move Europe and the United States closer together. This was going to end conflicts. We were all going to move towards greater integration, so on and so forth. And, the EU is having problems. There's, not just the Brits, there's other members of the EU that have issues. We're seeing democracy in retreat in various countries in Europe, even members of the EU and NATO. We're seeing newer generations rejecting the traditional politics whether in Germany with the rise of the Greens coming in and the Alternative for Deutschland, or in other places. Macron was a good example of a non-traditional politician. And that's, I think, we're entering into this era of uncertainty, and Europe is a harbinger of this. But I think the United States is not far behind, and this is why I will read with great interest, the forthcoming piece in the Politico magazine about this, because I think we've been used to these landmarks in our domestic and foreign policy for so long, and those landmarks are shifting. And we don't know what it's going to look like. And that creates uncertainty. It creates unease. If you say, look, Europe is going to look a lot different 5-10 years from now, the United States may look a lot different 5-10 years from now. And that's unsettling for people. And I think we're seeing that spill over even to what we see, going back to what we see, the anxiety as it's reflected on Twitter of people about where the country is going and what's happening. But we're leaving a familiar era of the last 30 years, and we're moving into new ground. And it's, in some ways, it's not dissimilar to what happened. That if you went into suspended animation in 1986 and were revived in 1994, the world would look very different. And you would be very confused where are all of these things I've grown to expect. And I think we're in a similar period now. And the pandemic is just accelerating that. COVID is the lockdowns, the disruptions, the economic crisis it creates, the political crisis it creates. It's not just in the United States that you have people not wanting to wear masks or social distance or anything like that. We're seeing this all replicated across Europe as well. And it's all playing into this.
Go ahead.
Europe as a harbinger. We unfortunately talked about last time. We were looking at Europe's second wave happening, and now the wave has hit us. So the time frame of this harbinger is much faster. Here in New York, we're locking down certain areas again, and I think that's going to happen more and more. The other thing I think we need to look to Europe is how they're treating their migration. There's been a lot of talk because of what happened in the camp in Greece of refugees setting the camp on fire because of the pandemic and how they were treated, and a look at how do we treat people at our borders. There were stories of a new caravan coming from Honduras last week, and what our policy to immigration is going to be. Nahal, you mentioned that we are definitely changing under a new administration, the policies, but do you see what either a Biden or Trump, what do you see specifically changing immigration? How does that impact us here at our doorstep?
Well, I mean, there's a slew of, executive orders and other regulatory changes that the Trump administration has put in to effectively build a virtual wall, a bureaucratic wall that makes it extremely hard for people to immigrate to the United States legally, I should say, and not just illegally, and also to become citizens. I mean, they've made it so much harder that and they've slowed everything down. And so I think you're going to see a lot of moves to, change those things back to, more normal speeds, more normal times, more normal rules. At the same time, I think you're definitely going to see like the lifting of travel bans on places like, Nigeria and some of these other countries that have been affected. Those are some of the easy things. And we know that Biden has said he's going to bring in more refugees, and not only he wants to have a minimum 95,000 that he brings in at least for the next few years, because the United States needs to, in his opinion, make up for the last few years of accepting so many fewer refugees. And when the U.S. does this, it sets an example, and other countries will step up as well. But look, I think the bottom line is, when it comes to migration and refugees in particular, the entire world needs to sit down and rethink the entire system, because it is completely outdated. It is decades old. It was a post-World War II thing. They came up with the refugee conventions, I believe it was 1951, 1967, if I'm remembering the dates correctly. And I've actually studied this stuff a lot, because I tried to help, long story, but I tried to help someone, who was in a bad situation refugee-wise. And the one thing I learned as I read all this stuff is, my God, it's not relevant anymore to the way borders work now, to the way people get around now, and to the factors that are driving people to migrate, right? So we need to have a massive rethink of how we determine who is a refugee, who is an asylum seeker, and what counts and what doesn't. And one of the key reasons is because of the climate change issue. There already are, to some extent, refugees who are having to flee wherever they are because the climate has changed. There are parts of the Middle East that are going to be completely unlivable, right, in the future, if the climate situation goes the way that it's going. And people are going to have to go places. And so the question is, how are we going to deal with these things? And this is not something that the United States can do by itself. It requires a global approach to this. And I think my sense is that the Biden team has the desire to try to take the leadership on something like this. But that means also that you're going to have to bring on people like Russia, like China, all these people who often, are not inclined to agree. But on the other hand, this could be one area where they're like, you know what, maybe this is something where we can work with an adversary because we're all facing the same challenge.
Nick, do you have anything to add to that?
I just think that's. I think it's a good way to begin bracketing this issue as something that isn't just it happens this year or next year, but that this is one of these systemic issues over time, and the fact of what's happening with climate shift all over the world raises, again, fundamental questions about where people are going to live when they can't live where they were originally living because it's too hot, it's too dry, there's no water, we can't grow food here anymore. What do you do with the countries that are the haves in terms of fresh water? Russia, Canada, for example, which are also countries that happen to be grossly underpopulated, in the sense of that they can take a lot more people. And I think, but this will exacerbate some of these domestic political conflicts as well of, what's mine is mine and it's not yours. And, borders become, you should stay on your side of the line. Well, I can't stay on my side of the line because it's not livable anymore. Well, is that my problem? Not my problem. How is this going to work out? And again, this is one of these changing landmarks issues. And again, just a second, that the refugee conventions are hopelessly out of date. They were designed for people fleeing. The templates were Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. Not, we don't have provisions for recognizing people as refugees. Where yes, there's a government that ostensibly runs this country, but in reality, criminal gangs run the country or run where you live, and you come and you say, well, I have a fear of persecution, and someone says, well, it's not from the government, therefore you're not, an asylum seeker, because, you're saying, well, organized crime is threatening me, or a gang or a militia is threatening me, and the rules haven't caught up to that because the rules still think in terms of it has to be the SS or the KGB after you, not a gang or some other entity. But yeah, these are these issues. And again, the question, both for a Trump administration, if there's a second term, or for a Biden administration is, and I know we overuse these terms about national conversations and the like, but there are going to have to be sustained political discussions beyond sound bites at debates with bumper stickers about we should be open to the world and make friends, or we should be strong. It's really, what are we prepared to do? What are the risks to us if we don't do something? What do our values tell us to do? If we claim to be guided by our values, what do our values tell us to do? And you need leaders that are going to be able to lead and not just simply do a bunch of opinion polling and saying, well, this is what people think right now, so we're not going to have a policy. I mean, this really does, and, it calls to, and this is where Nahal, going back to your thing about what does Gen Z think? Yeah, this is where leadership has to come in. And if leaders are not leading, then people are going to question whether the people in front of them are in fact doing their jobs.
And let's not forget one key reason that there are so many fissures about this it's racism. It's religious bigotry. Okay, I mean, a lot of the reason that there's so much resistance to migration in Europe coming, the migrants, is because many of them are Muslim or they're darker skin. I mean, I think the one thing we've definitely learned over the past 20 years is that racism is alive and well, and it's continuing to be a scourge that we're going to have to deal with, and that's not going to go away anytime soon.
Absolutely, and certainly it became an issue last night that both Kamala and Harris addressed, and Pence kind of dodged when asked directly about the white supremacy statements coming out of President Trump's debate last week. And so I think that this will continue to be something we look at as we look forward to. Well, I don't know if there'll be a debate next week. We're still waiting on a decision. President Trump announced he wasn't going to do a virtual one. We'll see. If there is, we'll have lots to talk about. If there isn't, we'll have lots to talk about, because these issues do need to be addressed, and we will be looking at pre-election predictions in our next podcast, because it will be our final podcast before the election. So super exciting, looking forward. I want to end with saying we're also so excited about the Nobel Prizes being awarded. I don't know, that news has also gone under the radar this week.
Did Trump win? Has Trump won one?
I think somebody nominated him for the Peace Prize, but that we won't know that for a couple months. But what has been awarded is the chemistry award last week to 2 scientists working on genome editing, that CRISPR tool. That's a whole nother topic of discussion. And today, the Nobel Prize in Literature went to the American poet Louise Gluck, I think is her pronunciation. So exciting. Look for some good news too at the Doorstep. We want to always give you all the news and good news as well. Thank you very much, Nahal, for joining us. We really appreciate your comment, and so looking forward to reading your article on Biden, the progressives, and foreign policy.
I'm so looking forward to it being published.
That's wonderful. So thank you to everyone. And as always, you can send questions and comments to us via Twitter, either for Tatiana at Tatiana Serafin, or directly to the Carnegie Council at Carnegie Council.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.